So today we're going to be talking about agents that need a buff and some that need a nerf. And here, just as a kind of reference point, is some of the agent pick rates from the NA Open Qualifiers, so you can kind of get a decent sense of, who's doing well, who's doing not so well, and all of that stuff, who might need a buff, who might need a nerf. And we're going to start off with the nerfs and, these agents towards the top, and then in the second half of the video, we'll go to buffs and agents that need to be brought up. And so let's start with Killjoy, who will be our first target here, as Killjoy is really seeing a lot of pick rate on pretty much every map. And outside of Split, where I expect Cypher will be the main pick, and maybe Fracture, I think Cypher could probably end up being the main pick there as well. Killjoy on, I think, all of the other 5 maps is going to be a pretty dominant choice. And so we need to bring Killjoy's pick rate down, right? We need to readdress that balance a bit, I think, between her, Cypher, and Chamber, if possible. And the way I would do this is a very simple change. This might not make the biggest difference in the world, but I think it's at least a start. And that is, of course, to change the ultimate. And I think the change that I would make, just to start off, would be to make the ultimate 8 cost. They mentioned when they made a bunch of other ultimates 8 cost, like Breach and Viper, that they wanted, ultimates that had site-wide footprints to be 8 cost ults. And that seems like almost they missed the Killjoy ult then, because of course the Killjoy ult definitely has a site-wide footprint, if not even bigger. Right, so I think that because, it got harder to destroy and all of that thing, we do need to make the Killjoy ultimate an 8 cost ult, because it's just too good, and that would be kind of the first part, I think, of, seeing where Killjoy would fall after that. And next we come to Jett, and this one is not as easy as Killjoy, because the problem is, how do you nerf Jett? Or does Jett even need a nerf? Because to me, the problem isn't necessarily Jett. The problem is kind of the way the game is and how the game works around the operator, because whichever agent is the best at using the op will be meta. And so this is kind of, I think, a bigger problem than just, oh, let's nerf Jett, because that isn't really the fix, right? The fix is, how do you fix the operator, I think? How do you make it so that people feel like you don't necessarily need Jett or Chamber to be played on every single map to use the operator? Or do you not care, right? The devs might think that that's perfectly fine and they're happy with the way that that is. And so to me, it's not necessarily about nerfing Jett. If you want to fix this problem, it probably has to come with changing the operator in some way so that, Breach can use an op and it's fine, right? Or your Astra or Viper can use an op and it's absolutely fine, right? That would be kind of the solution where you're not having to pick Jett or Chamber to use the op. Okay, next up is Sova at 58%, and this is a pretty high pick rate for Sova, and this has been a big change that we've seen going from, the kind of last meta where it was all raise fade into, a pretty heavy Sova meta. One of the reasons that I think Sova is getting a lot of pick rate is because he's pretty good at countering Killjoy, right? Whether it be shock darts to destroy nanoswarms or alarm bots, that's very effective, or whether it be, Sova ulting to destroy a Killjoy lockdown, or even shock darts to help destroy a Killjoy lockdown. Sova is just better than Fade at countering Killjoy, and we're seeing a lot of Killjoy, so you're gonna see more Sova. But is Sova overpowered himself? I don't think so. Like, I really don't. And if you were gonna nerf Sova, then I don't even know exactly what you would nerf. And hopefully with, maybe nerfs to Killjoy instead, you'll see more of a balance between, Sova and Fade. And for me, lastly, when it comes to nerfs, will come to KO, who had a 49% pick rate, and I think his ult is very good, his nade is good, his flashes are good, his knife is very good. All of those abilities are just pretty good, and that makes KO very unique in that I think KO is probably the only agent where I would be willing to say you are good to very good on every single map. So my personal choice of how to nerf KO, and there are different ways you could do this, but my personal choice would be to make the KO knife, the E ability, just make that radius a bit smaller. But I think that would be a fair nerf. It's nothing too crazy. You wouldn't have to make it tiny, just make it a bit smaller, and I think we'd be okay. And KO would still be a very, very good agent, of course, but I think it would just help bring KO down to the level maybe of some of the others in his class. But now let's come to the bottom of the list and talk about the agents that need a buff. And let's start at the very bottom with, of course, an agent you all knew was going to be on this list, and Harbor. Harbor, of course, ever since coming out, has been, one of the worst agents probably in the game, and slowly, they've buffed him, and now I think we've got to a point where we're pretty close. We aren't too far away from Harbor being a decent pick, but I do think that, with some small buffs, he could become, a decent pick on a couple maps. One of those buffs, and I've said this for a while, is take away the allied slow of running through a wall. Controllers' smokes should not be detrimental to their own team because they are so essential, and so I think removing the ally slow on the wall just makes a lot of sense. And the second thing is, Harbor, I think one of the problems Harbor has is not only a difficult agent to use, but sometimes he's a bit clunky. That sometimes when you try and use Harbor in a correct way, you find yourself not really being able to, right? And one of the reasons for that is the cascade, and you can only send it straight out. I know a lot of people have called for this, but I think it could be a decent change if implemented correctly, of allowing Harbor to rotate the cascade and push it out at a different angle so that he can get a perfect wall that he wants, rather than having to settle for one that maybe has gaps in it or isn't perfect instead. And now let's come to an interesting one, which is Chamber. And there's a lot of things, of course, that you could do for Chamber to buff him. I know some of you will be saying, don't buff Chamber, leave him in the dumps. But let's talk about buffing Chamber and how to do it. Because to me, there's some things that, would be very dangerous, and there's some things that I think would be okay. So things that would be very dangerous to me, obviously, don't touch the Rendezvous. So you have the other three abilities, right? The ult, the trademark, and the headhunter. And to me, I know a lot of people are going to say, well, buff the trademark, right? Either give him 2 or, have the range be gone on the trademark again. I really don't think they're going to do the range thing, just because when they made the Chamber ult, the way that they talked about Cypher and how it should be Cypher's identity, that he's this ultimate web who knows what's going on all the way across all the maps, and it didn't make sense to have another agent who can just do that as well. I don't think they're going to change the range. So I don't think they're going to really change that. But I think you could change the headhunter and the ult as well. You can make the ult fire rate what it was, and it would be fine. Agents can have a strong ult but not be broken. Phoenix is a bad agent who has a very good ult. Also, I would make the headhunter bullets cost 100 again. It's a fine ability, and it would be fine again if the bullets cost 100. This would give you maybe more of a reason to pick Chamber, but I don't think it would break him at all, and so those would be my changes. And now let's move on to Phoenix, and to me, Phoenix has one problem in that he has 2 bad abilities, right? His flash is good, ult's good, but the wall and the molly aren't good, and I think you can get away with having 1 bad ability, but 2 is too much. And so to me, I'd probably be looking at his free ability, the E, the molly, and trying to buff that if we can. It's his free ability, that's what you want to be central to the character. Maybe have him heal more from it, maybe have it be bigger, maybe have it, damage enemies more or whatever, or faster or whatever it is, right? All of that stuff, just make the molly better. And now let's come to Yoru, and this one is a bit of an odd change, maybe a bit out of left field, but I would make the Yoru ult 6 cost. Not because it's a bad ult, but because I want there to be like a reason to pick Yoru, and having a 6 cost Yoru ult means that you can get it maybe 3-4 times in a half. And if you can do that, that is a big incentive of playing Yoru, because the Yoru ult is pretty strong, right? It has a unique use. It gives you very good information, can be chained with other ults very well also. So getting it more times per half is going to be pretty strong, but I know that it's not going to break Yoru, because Yoru is an agent. I think that if you, tweak it a bit wrong, then you are going to break him. Very quickly, we'll talk about Reyna. I made a whole video about this, about how you can't really buff or nerf Reyna, because if you nerf her, she becomes just an agent that might as well not exist, and if you buff her, then she becomes every ranked game's worst nightmare, so Reyna, we're just going to leave. And now let's quickly come to Neon, and to me, I would give Neon the damage back on the wall. I think that, I don't know if they thought that that was a buff, but I really do think that that was a nerf. Even just psychologically, even if you take, just a tiny bit of damage, people are less likely to peek into that wall if they think they are going to take a bit of damage. So I would give Neon back the damage on the wall, and I would also give her, her running ability, her sprinting, just a bit quicker recharge time perhaps as well, right? Just make it a bit easier for her to, run around a bit more, do what Neon is meant to do. And now let's come to Skye, and Skye's problem is that the other agents in her class are just too good. They're just better than her, right? It's not even that Skye is bad, it's just that the other agents are better than Skye in her class. So the buff I'm going to suggest for Skye is to make her ult 6 cost as well. Now, Skye's ult used to cost 6, and again, it's not that Skye's ult is bad, But this would again give you a reason to pick Skye over some of the other initiators. Every other initiator has an 8 cost ult. Again, it gives you a bit of a reason to maybe run with Skye as opposed to some of these other agents, right? If you think you can get a lot of Skye ults in a game and that's going to be the difference, between Skye versus another agent, then that's going to be a reason to pick Skye, particularly if you think there's a free ult up for you, be it on attackers or defenders side. So it gives Skye, it gives you a reason to pick Skye. It's a unique selling point of Skye is that you would have a decent ultimate that would be much more readily available compared to the other initiators. And then the final agent I'm going to pick on here is Brim. And the reason I'm going to pick on Brim is because, again, Brim is losing Bind, so he only really has Fracture as one of his maps. I don't think Split, I don't think Lotus will be Brim maps, most likely. And so Brim is going to have a pretty low pick rate. So again, how do we potentially curtail and make Brim an agent to be picked on these maps? You give him back the second stimmy. Now, you can keep the cost at 200 still, but when Brim had the second stimmy, some teams actually were trying Brim on Ascent, on Haven, maps like that, right? And that was the first time we'd really seen that for Brim. But if Brim's going to see even a decent pick rate right now, he's going to need to see some pick rate on those maps. And so the way you have to do that is probably by giving Brim that second stimmy and, allowing teams to kind of use that to the advantage and see where they go from there. So yeah, my change for Brim would be go and give him the second stim. And so those are just my changes. I'm sure all of you have your own little opinions on every single change that, needs to be made or whatever. I think we can all agree that the general goal should be that we want to bring the top ones down a bit, but not too far, and the ones at the bottom up a bit, but again, not too far, and just end up in a more balanced meta overall. And so that was kind of the idea of these changes.